Guilt, fear, and exhaustion, the impact of toxic psychological relationships, the silent shadow that consumes the soul. There is a type of suffering that leaves no visible marks, yet destroys the essence of those who endure it, layer by layer, in a slow and painful process. It is the suffering generated by toxic psychological relationships, those invisible webs of manipulation where guilt, fear, and exhaustion become the pillars of an emotional prison. Unlike an acute trauma, which causes an immediate and obvious rupture, relational toxicity acts like a slow-acting poison, altering the perception of reality, undermining self-esteem, and transforming the affected person into a shadow of their former self, constantly questioning their sanity and worth. The victim, often without understanding what is happening, feels eternally indebted, perpetually frightened of the next outburst or the next punishing silence, and irremediably tired of fighting a battle they didn't even know they were engaged in. The vicious cycle of psychological destruction. With this in mind, have you ever found yourself in a cycle where the need to please or avoid conflict overrides your own well-being and sense of identity? The dynamic of a toxic relationship is insidious in its subtlety. It rarely begins with grand acts of cruelty, but rather with small concessions, strategic compliments followed by destructive criticisms disguised as concern or help, and the skillful use of gaslighting, the distortion of reality that makes the victim doubt their memory, their perception, and even their own sanity. The toxic partner, whether a spouse, a family member, a friend, or a coworker, operates from a place of deep insecurity, projecting their own flaws and fears onto the other person. The person under the effect of this manipulation begins to internalize the narrative that they are the problem, they are responsible for the imbalance, and they need to try harder to fix the relationship. The anatomy of perpetual guilt. Guilt is, perhaps, the most effective tool in the arsenal of a psychological manipulator. It is not the healthy guilt we feel upon making a genuine mistake, it is an imposed, manufactured guilt. The toxic partner is a master at turning the tables. If they cheat, the blame is placed on the victim for not being attentive enough. If they erupt in anger, the blame is on the victim for provoking them. Guilt is used to paralyze the victim's reaction and ensure their continuous submission. It is the silent justification for remaining in an unsustainable situation. The victim starts to live in a state of constant policing of their words, actions, and even thoughts, in the vain hope that if they are perfect, the pain will cease. But perfection is a moving target, and the object of blame is continually repositioned, ensuring that control remains in the hands of the aggressor. This constant self-censorship leads to the erosion of identity, where the person begins to define themselves not by who they are, but by what they must not be in order not to offend, not to irritate, and not to be blamed again. Imprisonment by fear. Alongside guilt, fear forms the second pillar of this psychological prison. It is not just physical fear, although in many cases, the threat of physical harm is implied. It is the fear of losing love, the fear of rejection, the fear of abandonment, the fear of loneliness, or, the most devastating of all, the fear of being wrong about one's own reality. The aggressor uses fear strategically, veiled threats of ending the relationship, of exposing secrets, of damaging the victim's social or professional reputation, or even self-harm as a form of manipulation. The victim lives on tenterhooks, monitoring the partner's mood like a seismograph, trying to anticipate the storm and navigating an emotional minefield. The home, which should be a safe haven, transforms into a silent battlefield, where peace is only the truce between one conflict and the next. Fear creates chronic hypervigilance that drains mental and emotional energy, making escape a terrifying and often unthinkable idea, as the manipulation has already convinced them that the world outside is far more dangerous than the gilded, or barbed wire, cage they find themselves in. The exhaustion that transcends the physical. And it is in this macabre dance of guilt and fear that exhaustion settles in permanently. It is not just the body's fatigue after a day of work, it is the depletion of the soul. The exhaustion of constantly having to manage another person's emotions. The exhaustion of trying to be good enough, of explaining the unexplainable, of proving the obvious, and of fighting a narrative that only exists in the manipulator's mind. It is emotional burnout in its most destructive form. The body, under chronic stress, reacts with a series of symptoms: insomnia, generalized anxiety, headaches, digestive issues, and, in more severe cases, the development of autoimmune diseases. The energy that should be used for personal growth, for joy, and for building a fulfilling life, is entirely drained for daily survival within the toxic dynamic. The victim no longer has the strength to react, to plan an escape, or even to dream. They settle for the absence of pain as a temporary substitute for happiness, living in a state of inertia and emotional stupor. The slow and painful process of awakening. The path to freedom is long and full of relapses, as the manipulator often intensifies their tactics when they realize they are losing control. The awakening often begins with a small glimpse of clarity, a fleeting instant where the victim notices the incongruity between what they feel and what they are told. It might be a friend's comment, reading an article, or a moment of silence that allows the long-suppressed inner voice to whisper the truth. This awakening is painful because it implies recognizing that the story of love or dedication one believed they were living was, in fact, a mirage, and that the time invested was largely spent in vain trying to save something that never wanted to be saved. The denial phase is powerful, as it is easier and less terrifying to maintain the illusion than to face the brutal reality of having been deceived, devalued, and, worse, having allowed it to happen. Anger, sadness, and finally, acceptance, come in waves, and seeking professional help becomes crucial to dismantle the limiting beliefs and internalized lies. Building the bridge to healing and autonomy. Healing is not an event, but a process of reconstruction. It is about reversing the gaslighting, reaffirming one's own reality, one fact at a time. It is relearning to trust one's own instincts, the inner voice the manipulator worked so hard to silence. It involves setting firm and non-negotiable boundaries, often requiring the radical severance of the toxic relationship, which is known as no contact. This is an act of profound self-love and courage, as it means facing the fear of abandonment and the pressure of imposed guilt. Therapy acts as a mirror and a map, helping the victim reconnect with their lost identity, heal the wounds of self-esteem, and develop tools to identify and avoid future destructive dynamics. It is the journey of stepping out of the shadow of guilt into the light of personal responsibility, not responsibility for what the other person did, but responsibility for one's own happiness and well-being. The rediscovery of autonomy is the most potent antidote to the poison of manipulation. The strength of vulnerability and hope. Ultimately, the story of someone who survives a toxic relationship is a story of immense strength. It is a strength that lies in the vulnerability of admitting the pain, the courage to ask for help, and the resilience to get up after being knocked down countless times. The wound may leave a scar, but this scar serves as a silent reminder not of the pain, but of the victory over it. Overcoming these dynamics proves that the human spirit has an incredible capacity to heal and flourish again, even after being severely pruned. Hope resides in the fact that recognizing toxicity is the first step toward reclaiming one's life, and that genuine happiness is not found in external approval, but in the integrity and love we cultivate for ourselves. Interacting with the reader. The impact of these relationships is undeniable, and the suffering they cause is deep and long-lasting. Do you believe that, as a society, we are prepared to recognize the seriousness of psychological abuse as immediately and forcefully as we recognize physical abuse? What is your opinion on the subject discussed, and do you believe that cases of deeply entrenched toxicity, especially in family or professional contexts, have a complete solution, or is the best path always radical detachment?